Tak pekný dobrý večer. My vás síce nevidíme, ale tušíme, že vás tu je veľmi veľa. Ja som tu len ako stojan za mikrofón, teda stojan na mikrofón pre Kristínu, ale som z Novej Cvernovky, jeden z dramaturgov. A my robíme veľa našich podujatí, ale veľmi radi spolupracujeme s inštitúciami, ktoré sú nám blízke. A takými aj vydavateľstvo Absint, ktoré vlastne po vyše 2 rokoch po pandémii tu s nami robí samostatný event a sme veľmi radi, že vy ste nezanevreli na Absint a ani na Cvernovku a myslím, že nás čaká pomerne jedinečný večer. Ak niekto ste prehliadli, tak prednáška bude v angličtine, máme zabezpečené tlmočenie do slovenčiny, verím, že mnohí viete po anglicky, ale ak by niekto potreboval, tak myslím, že aj tuto na pulte máme ešte nejaké tlmočnícke slúchatka, alebo aj vonku si môžete zobrať. A stále aj pred diskusiou, aj po diskusii si ešte budete môcť kúpiť knižku, ktorú dnes budeme, nie priamo, ale ktorej autor je tu dnes s nami. No a toto nie je úplne ani bežný event ani pre nás v Cvernovke a na jeho príprave sme spolupracovali aj s iniciatívou Bez návodu, ktorú tu zastupuje Kristína Alexi Převrátil a teda ju poprosím o pár slov, nech nám možno aj povie, čo sú zač a aj čo je na tomto večeri špeciálne.
Ďakujem. Teraz si ma zaskočil, lebo ja mám prípravu urobenú, čo chcem povedať, lebo by som povedala nebodaj, čo si myslím, a to by sme nechceli. Tak začnem tak, ako som si naplánovala. Takže dnes mám zhodou okolností tú česť privítať na pódiu Daniela Tammeta a teraz by som mala povedať, že čo on je, nejakú škatulku, tak sa to zvykne, že je. No tak pri ňom je asi najviac spisovateľ, ale zdá sa mi to také nedostatočné, lebo tú škatulku spisovateľa zo všetkých strán presahuje. Ale najviac spisovateľ preto, lebo hovorím, prináša ho Absint, ktorý vydáva knihy, takže je to asi rola, ktorá teraz je aktuálna. Pre mňa je jeho písanie skôr jeden zo spôsobov, ako nám dáva vedieť, kto je a ako myslí. To mi príde podstatnejšie. To, že presahuje hranice škatuliek, je vlastné nielen jemu, ale podľa mňa aj všetkým ostatným neurodivergentným ľuďom, ktorí myslia inak, krásne atypicky, pokiaľ majú možnosť to realizovať. Prekračujú zavedené hranice, porušujú stereotypy, odhalujú nové perspektívy. Pre mňa najpresnejšie vyjadrenie je, že odkrývajú nové štruktúry významov. A originalita a tvorivosť potom nie je nejaký náhly záblesk intuície alebo osvietenia, ale skôr systematické poukazovanie na nový rozmer reality, ktorý pre ostatných je nesamozrejmý alebo málo viditeľný. Mám pocit, že toto Daniel robí. A tiež rozpíja hranice medzi vedou a poéziou, čo je také zvláštne, ako keď kvapka vody padne na farby a rozpijú sa spolu. Veľmi ma baví, ako prežíva jazyk, doslova prežíva všetky jeho otiene, rozmery, tvárnosť, aj kultúrnu podmienenosť významov, ako vidí čísla a slova, ako ich cíti vo farbách a v priestore. To je úplne fascinujúce. A toto jedinečné myslenie nám dokáže sprostredkovať, čo je skvelé. A dokáže tak povedať o sebe, ale podľa mňa aj o nás, o ľuďoch, o človeku. A do veľkej miery aj o tom, v akom svete žijeme a ako veľmi si často neuvedomujeme, čo robíme a čo všetko okolo nás je. No a ako autistka sa veľmi teším, že tento event je aj o tom, že prekračuje hranice škatulky autizmu, pretože Daniel nie je jediný, ale viacerí ľudia poukazujú na to, že hoď sme na spektre, tak máme predstavivosť, máme tvorivosť, máme empatiu, napriek tomu, že medicína tvrdí opak, čiže problém bude asi niekde inde. No a posledná vec, predtým nechám zahlbiť sa do Danielovej osobnosti, tak chcem povedať, že tento event bude špecifický, ohľaduplný k našim zmyslom. Dali sme dokopy leták, ktorý ste si zrejme našli. Na tom letáku sú napísané podrobnosti, poviem dve veci, ktoré sú podľa mňa dôležité. Tu je miestnosť, kde sa dá vybehnúť, ujsť, keď sa človek cíti preťažený alebo si chce oddychnúť. A druhá vec, nebudeme tlieskať. Budeme ohľaduplní k ušiam a možno by sme si to mohli aj skúsiť. Namiesto tlieskania budeme robiť jazz hands a môžete si to skúsiť spolu so mnou. Môžete pomaly, môžete rýchlo, môžete s prstami. Ako budete chcieť. Tak ďakujem za tú ohľaduplnosť, že si ten event tým pádom môžeme užiť spoločne, všetci. A chcela by som dať už slovo Danielovi, lebo o ňoho ide.
Čiže ďakujem Kristíne za veľmi pekné slova, aj za to, že teda naozaj nám pomohli vyskúšať si takýto typ podujatia. Aj my sa radi učíme a inklúzia je veľkou témou aj pre kultúrne centra, takže myslím, že teraz môžete jazzovými rukami naozaj Daniela privítať. Nevidíme vás úplne, ale tušíme, že nám takto tlieskate, takže ďakujeme pekne. Daniel.
So thank you, thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here in Bratislava. It's my first time in Slovakia. I want to do two things before I begin this evening. I want to give some thanks. So I will begin by thanking Filip Ostrowski and the team at Absinthe, my publisher, who has made all of this possible this evening. So thank you, Filip. I want to thank the centre here for everything that they do and for making this event possible as well, and for hosting us. I also want to thank the translators, the interpreters this evening, who are making me sound so good in Slovak. And I want to thank the translator of my book, who is here this evening. And you know, my writing is apparently quite good, but in Slovak it's probably even better. So it's thanks to her, you know. I want to also thank the rain, because it stopped, and so you could come here and not be completely wet. And as far as I know, I saw when I was coming in that there was a lady with a sausage dog. I don't know if she's here still with her dog, but if she is, then I'm very happy, because I like to do things for the first time, and this will be the first time that I speak in front of a sausage dog. So I hope that I will be able to make myself understandable to the dog as well. So I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to open up the room for questions. If you have some questions, please don't be shy and ask away in English or in Slovak. I have interpretation. I am, as was said so beautifully and generously, I'm a writer, a poet, a novelist, essayist. I've won awards, and I've been translated into around 30 languages all around the world. And I feel like I'm always like the backup for my books, that the books are really the stars, not me, and they go all around the world and they collect all these wonderful accents, and they speak many more languages than I do, and I just have to follow them everywhere. And so this book has led me to Slovakia, and so I'm very happy to be here with you this evening. But the main part of my talk is not going to be so much about my life today and the awards and the many books and so on. It's more about how I got to where I am today, because the journey was a long one, and so it's more about that process, that evolution, that I want to speak about this evening. So I want to take your minds back to London and specifically to the east of London, where I was born and raised. My first language was, on paper, it was officially English, because my parents only spoke English at home. And the difficulty I had growing up is that even though my parents spoke to me in English and I was meant to understand English and speak in English, and I spoke English in my own way and with my own accent apparently and my own sentences, and I could understand and they could understand me because they were my parents and they could, you know, understand their child, but it always felt like a foreign language to me. And from speaking with other neurodiverse men and women in recent years, I understand that this is quite common, in fact, for individuals on the spectrum, that they feel growing up that they are in a foreign country and that they are speaking a foreign language. And so this is one reason why I felt so strongly that I wanted to one day to travel and to explore the world. And writing, of course, and literature is a wonderful way of doing that. Every time you open a book, you are traveling. So even in times of COVID, it was possible to travel very far, perhaps even galaxies and universes away from where you were, thanks to the power of words and publishing. And I was the eldest, I'm the eldest of 9 children, so a big family, like a school, just a special school for stimulating me and helping me to learn social skills and to understand how things happen, how things work. My brothers and sisters loved me for who I was, with all of my eccentricities. I talk about these somewhat in my book, my first book, which is the book that has been translated so far in Slovak. And I was a very shy child. I wouldn't have said shy, I would have said I was the number 4. Because for me the number 4 was the feeling of shyness, the feeling of being quiet because you don't know what to say at that particular moment, how to make yourself understood, how to connect. And that's the number 4. And it's not about counting as such, it's about an emotion. The number 4 represents in this language, which is almost really like my first language, my true first language, not numbers as such, but a numerical private language that is my own and developed spontaneously, intuitively in my early childhood. This language is something that accompanies me, and I am constantly interpreting myself. I am my own interpreter in my mind from this language of numbers, shapes, because numbers have shapes. The closest I can compare it to is the hieroglyphics in Egypt, or the ideograms in Chinese and other Asian languages. And these, to Western eyes, look like just squiggles on a page. But of course, to those who understand, they represent meanings, they represent stories, they represent inner lives. And so when I am thinking with numbers or with words, because for me there is not a clear distinction between the two, what I am doing is exploring these shapes and colors and textures. So, for example, if I take the title of my book in Slovak, I won't try to pronounce it, but the first word is brown, because it begins with the letter N, and this is a brown color like chestnuts. The V, the second word, is violet, purple. The next word is dark blue, almost purple. And the last word is silver. And there are also textures, there are also emotions, and this is how I experience both numbers and languages. So when I am reading a sentence, or when I was a child and I was doing sums in maths class, for example, when I am writing, it is an experience that is not just intellectual, it's emotional, it is perceptual, it involves my whole body and my whole memory, and it's very intensive and very powerful. So let me talk a little bit about school. I went to, well, for context, I went to an ordinary school. By ordinary, I mean a classical standard school. And that wasn't so much by choice or by design. It was simply because that was how it was in the 1980s. I'm showing my age now. In the 1980s, there was not the awareness of neurodiversity at all. Asperger's was not a definition. It did not exist as a definition in the English-speaking world. And so it was necessary for children like myself simply to fit in, to try and find their place in society. And this was something that had difficulties, that represented difficulties, of course, for someone who was unable really to understand why I was so different. And my parents, always were asking themselves, are we doing something wrong? Is there something more we can do? So there were many, many questions. And at the same time, there was love. There was immense love, unconditional love. And I think that this was the most important part of my success. I went to school. My teachers were protective of me. They could see that I was different from the other children. And they could see that there was a contrast between the classroom, where I was a good student. I enjoyed studying, I enjoyed books, I enjoyed learning, and then the playground, where I did not know what to do at all, and I was completely lost. And I remember very clearly those days when I would try to understand other children, and I would study them like an anthropologist studies other tribes far away, or even like a scientist who tries to study something that he has not seen before, and tries to figure out what is happening, what is conversation, what is how are they doing this, and I realized that I needed some help, and I went to the library. There was a library, of course, at the school, and there was a bigger library, a municipal library, a town library. And because my family was very poor, my parents were full-time parents, there were many children to feed, we didn't have much money, we didn't have any access to culture, but there was a library, and the library was free, and so I had access to culture in the form of the library. I went and spent a big part of my childhood in books, in the library, all kinds of books. I began with dictionaries, just because of the colors and the textures and the emotions, and then I moved to encyclopedias, and then to poems and novels. And the novels were very old, of course. I didn't know this. They were very old and very from the 1950s. And so the English in them was a very strange English from the 1950s. It wasn't an English that children spoke in playgrounds. And I was trying to use this English in the playgrounds with the children. And it wasn't working at all, unfortunately. So this first attempt to speak good English with these other children, it didn't work. And I blamed it on the novels. I said the novels were very badly written and I should find better novels with better writing, and then I would be able to speak good English. And the reason I went to novels for this learning experience is because in literature it is possible to read people's thoughts. It is possible to look inside people's minds and inside people's hearts. It's the only place we can do this. And we do this using what we call dialogue. The writer will either use dialogue to represent a conversation between two or more characters in the story, and sometimes the narrator will actually say his own thoughts, not out loud, but in his head. But because it's all on the page, we can read what he is not saying. We can actually hear what he is not saying. Because he is not saying it, he is seeing it in his mind, or listening to his own voice in his mind. And these are the wonderful mysteries that we make possible in reading and writing. And people don't think about it, because reading is something that people take for granted, like so much in life we take for granted. And it's in fact quite a magical act. And so I have never lost sight of that magic and that mystery. And when I was reading, and I was looking inside the minds, and I was saying, okay, so this is how people think, and this is how a dialogue works. And gradually I learned to adapt what I was reading to what I was hearing in the playground, and more I learned conversation skills. I learned how to dialogue. I learned how to communicate. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fluent. It wasn't as natural or intuitive as for other children, including my brothers and sisters. But it didn't matter. It was enough. And then one day, when I was maybe 9 or 10, I met two children who really helped my life. The first child was a girl. Her name was Heidi. Her parents moved 2 doors away from us, and her mother came from Finland in Scandinavia, and she spoke Finnish, and of course English as well, but her first language was Finnish. And her daughter, she wanted her daughter to speak Finnish as well. Her father was, the daughter's father was English speaking, so they had made a decision not to raise her in Finnish because the father did not speak Finnish. But now the mother was regretting her decision, and she wanted her daughter to speak some Finnish. So she gave her child a book, a picture book, a very simple children's book. And on every page there was a big picture, beautiful picture, colorful picture of a very common object, a shoe or an apple or a dog, not a sausage dog, but a dog. And the word underneath the picture in Finnish. And this girl, who was a friend of my sister's, she did not want to learn Finnish because she was not neurodiversity divergent. She wanted to be like the other girls. She was in England, her first language was English, her English was perfect. She didn't want to be different, she wanted just to speak English, so she didn't want the book. And so she left the book one day in my house, in my parents' house, with my sister. And when I discovered this book, it was like opening a treasure trove. It was the first time that I saw words in another language, in a language that wasn't English. And I cannot, even to this day, in words, tell you how powerful that emotion was. It was the closest emotion I could have is the emotion of falling in love. An emotion that I would have only many years later, of course, but it was very close to that emotion. You open a book and you see these words and you say to yourself, these are not my words, but they feel like my words. They could be my words, because they're not English and I don't feel English. I feel close to these words. I feel closer to these words even than to English words. And so I looked at these words and I learned as best I could with the help of the neighbor to pronounce these words. Dog is koira, cat is kissa, apple, homina. And these words are like very powerful pictures. The words themselves were even more powerful, colorful pictures than the pictures. So this showed me, it was like a window opening into another world. And I realized that I wanted to go through this window into this other world. And so I wanted to learn other languages. And this was the beginning of the process of going into the world and learning other languages. But before I say a little bit more about that, I want to talk about the second child that I met and who was very important to me. And he is also a character in this book. His name was Babak. Babak is not an English name. He came from Iran. This was in the end of the 1980s, and the Ayatollah had been in power for some years in Iran. And the family of Babak were religious. Their religion was a minority religion in Iran. They were Baha'is, and they were persecuted. I didn't know this at the time. I only knew that he came to my school one day and he didn't look like the other children. He quickly learned English, and he probably had even less accent than I had when he spoke English. His English was very good after only a very short time. And he loved numbers, like I did, and he loved words. And one day we played Scrabble together. And the only advantage I had over him was that he trusted me probably more than he should have done, because I was meant to be a native English speaker, and so I would sometimes put words on the Scrabble board that were not actually, officially English words. They were English words to me. They should have been in the dictionary, just that they weren't, or not yet. So I would always win at Scrabble, but probably not according to the official rules. And one day when we were playing one of these games of Scrabble, and I was putting down one of these wonderful poetic words that doesn't actually exist in official English, I gave him a piece of paper. And on the piece of paper was a poem that I had written, and I didn't know how to write it down, because this language that I speak in my mind, that I have always had, this language of numbers and shapes and colors and meanings, it doesn't have an alphabet. So I couldn't actually write it down. All I could do was put numbers down. And I felt very frustrated doing this because it just looked like a telephone number. It didn't look like what I could see in my head. It had no colors, had no shape, but it was the best I could do. So I put the numbers down and I gave it to him and I explained that it was a poem. And Babak was such a kind, warm, poetic boy that when he read the poem, he didn't understand, of course, the poem, but he said he liked it very much, and I'm sure he did. And he was my first reader, and I'm very grateful to him for that kindness. So I went on to secondary school, and I was, apart from Babak, I never really spoke to anyone about what I was seeing in my head. And one reason was that I assumed everyone in some way was doing this, was thinking like I did and feeling like I did. And we never, and also because in England, and probably it's the same everywhere, you just don't talk about what you're doing in your inner life. It's your inner life and you keep it for yourself, for better or for worse. And so I just did this as well. I just kept it to myself. But some of the teachers, they were perceptive. And one of the teachers, when I went on to secondary school, I started to learn more foreign languages, French, which I use today. I live in Paris and I write in both languages, English and French. German as well. I don't write in German, but I know some German, and I learned German in secondary school. And the teacher, the German teacher, she was very interesting. She was also very important to me. Her name was Frau, which means Mrs. Frau Kukel. Kukel is a very common English name because she was married to an Englishman. But her first name was Elfriede, which is a very common German name. So it was a very interesting combination of names. And she was a very eccentric lady. She would eat lots of garlic all the time. So you could smell her before you could see her. And she was a lovely woman. She would wear very unusual scarves and dresses, and she was very... And I think the other children, when she couldn't see or couldn't hear, they would mock her, they would make fun of her. But I never made fun of her, of course. I thought that she was wonderful. And she liked me because I guess she saw in me something like this, maybe similar eccentricity. I don't know if she was neurodiverse, maybe. Certainly she was different in her own way, and I liked this very much. And she invited me to her home to continue learning, because in school she had to teach me German. That was her job. She was paid to teach me German, so she taught me German. But in fact, what she wanted to do was teach me English. She wanted me to speak proper, correct, fluent English, to be confident in my English, to have no more doubts about my English, because my English was as valid and valuable as anyone else's. So she wanted to give me this confidence, this self-confidence, and this is the most precious thing that any teacher can give a student. So she took me to her home, and her home was like the novels that I read. These novels from the 1950s. I had never seen a home like it, except in these novels. There was this beautiful tablecloth on the table, and a beautiful teapot, and beautiful teacups. And so she took the beautiful teapot, and she served the tea in the beautiful teacups, and she served me the tea, and then we spoke, not in German, but in English. Because she wasn't paid anymore to talk to me. She could talk to me for free, you know, and say what she wanted to say. And she encouraged me. So she was my best English teacher, even though she was officially my German teacher. So you always have to be careful of these official labels, because, you know, native English speakers, German teachers, because in fact people are always infinitely more complex and rich than we assume. And I continued my schooling. It was not always easy, as you can imagine. The other children became quite nasty at times, and I was very lucky to have very protective parents and protective teachers, when it was got quite difficult, I could always escape to a book and go into count to myself. Counting was a way of escaping. And sometimes I didn't even realize. I realized perhaps later, but at the time I didn't even realize that I was being bullied sometimes, because maybe this is one of the advantages of being neurodiverse. Sometimes the bullying was too subtle for me. I didn't even realize. So it didn't work. And the bullies got bored and walked away, So this was perhaps lucky as well. But I counted, and one of the numbers that I started to count or started to think about in those moments when I needed to have this space for myself, away from the world's difficulties, was the number pi, P. P, you say in Slovakia. And this number, I first learnt about it when I was in high school, probably like yourselves. And I remember feeling, my first emotion when I saw this number, it was a little bit like the emotion I had when I saw these first words in Finnish in the picture book some years before. It was a little bit like that emotion of falling in love. And when I saw these numbers, I didn't see the numbers. I could see the beginning of a story, a beautiful story. It was the story of a boy who was on a hill, a beautiful green hill, on a spring day, and it was not early spring, late spring, the season of when you start to make your cheese here in Slovakia, the sheep's cheese. It's in this month, the month of May. It's that sort of season. And this is the beginning of pi for me. But I was so angry with the teachers because, and you will understand why, they gave me the beginning of the number, the beginning of this amazing story. So I'll say it in numbers. It's not the correct way of saying, but this is the only way I can explain it to you. So this is officially what pi is. But again, remember, Frau Kuhlkill was officially a German teacher, and she wasn't a German teacher. 3.141592. And that was it. And I said to myself, but where is the rest of the story? So the boy is on the hill, it's spring, it's almost summer, it's nice weather, the boy is looking out, and what happens next? What is the next number? And the next number? And the next number? What is the next picture, the next meaning, the next emotion? And there was nothing. It was the end of pi for the teacher in school. So I was very frustrated. I went to the library and I found the biggest, thickest book I could find with pi in it. Because this was the 1990s. I'm showing my age again. There was no internet. So you had to use books. And I found this big book and there was, I think, 500 numbers of pi. It was the most I could find. And I looked at this number and I said, this is how the story continues. There are rivers, there's sky, there's an adventure. This is a fantastic story. It's a beautiful story. It's like the Odyssey. It's like the Iliad. It's like the epics. It's all written in this language that perhaps only I can understand. But it's beautiful. So I learned, these numbers. I not consciously, but they stayed with me. And I kept this with me. I didn't say it to anyone. It was just part of who I was. It was part of my treasure. And then I left school. I didn't go to university straight away. I didn't have the social skills at the time. I would go to university many years later, or rather, university would come to me. I used a university in England called the Open University, and it is much more neurodivergent friendly because the lessons come to you in books and the internet when the internet was possible. And so I was able to get a very good degree in this way, in my 30s. But I'm getting ahead of the story, sorry. I was 18, and I did not go to university. And I went to Lithuania instead. So that's quite a big difference. University, Lithuania. But I decided I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the world. I wanted to find out more about the world. I wanted to find out more about myself. And so I went to Lithuania by chance, because I joined a scheme to, and this is one of the ironies in my life, I went to join a scheme because I wanted to travel and there were not many opportunities for people like myself and at that time, and one of the opportunities was teaching English. So I became a teacher of English. Very strange, but a wonderful irony. And so I applied, and they could have sent me to any of the countries of Eastern. They might even have sent me to Slovakia. That would have been wonderful. But instead they sent me to Lithuania. And I'm very happy that they did, because I learned many wonderful things in Lithuania, including some Lithuanian as well, a beautiful language. And of course, with what is happening in the world today, and I saw the Ukrainian flag, of course, as you all did, as we came in here. And of course, I'm a man of the world. I have my own inner life, but I'm very much part of a collective life. And I want to dedicate what I'm saying this evening to the people of Ukraine and what they are living through at the moment. And I want to thank you, all of you this evening, all of Slovakia, for your solidarity, for all that you are doing to welcome Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. When I was in Lithuania, this was a long time before what is happening now, more than nearly 25 years ago. It was not long after the Soviet Union fell, and the people, they were still very conscious of what it was like to live under Russian control. And they told me stories that have stayed with me, stories about not being able to speak in their own language. So the language that they shared with me, the Lithuanian language, had a power to it, like the power that Finnish had for me the first time I saw those words for apple and shoe and so on. Because for the Lithuanian people, the word for apple, obrolis, the word for numbers, 1, 2, 3, vienas, du, tris, these words had so much power for them because they were not allowed to say them for 50 years. And the only time that they could speak their language freely, without any fear, was in their dreams. Because, of course, nobody, not even the Russians, can control our dreams. And so the people told me these stories, and they became part of the books I would go on to write. They helped show me, again, another lesson in how powerful words can be. Words cannot do everything, unfortunately. I wish they could do more in the face of what is happening in the world today. But they can do so much. Words at their best do not only give us information, they give us the possibility of transformation. They really can make the world a better place to live in for everyone. And so when we use words, when we use language, whatever language it is, we do so with a great responsibility and great power. And it's something that I've always been conscious of, because my own journey has been such a long and complicated one. And but I'm very grateful for it, because I appreciate how much that power can represent, how much good it can do. So I was in Lithuania and I taught English. It was very funny, but apparently I was a very good English teacher, because perhaps precisely because I understood how difficult, how intimidating it can be to learn another language as an adult, and how confusing it can be. And the secret, if there is a secret, there's no trick, there's no technique, in my opinion. But there is a secret, and the secret is that language is not about dictionaries, it's not about lists of words, it's about stories, it's about pictures, and it's about poems. And the better you are able to follow the stories in language, including the story that language itself tells. Every language tells its own story, the story of itself. Slovak tells its own story just as much as Lithuanian does, and it's a completely different story, which makes it a completely different language. And just trying to follow the thread from word to word and meaning to meaning. Why do people say this? Why do people use that word there? Why does the grammar make this word change in this position? Just trying to figure this out. It's like a wonderful adventure story. The ones that you probably made up and have long ago forgotten as children. But these same approaches, intuitive and imaginative, are the best way, and probably the only way really, to get inside the heart and the mind of each language and the story each language tells about itself. I suppose Pi, in a way, is like a language that is at its heart universal. It belongs to everyone. And if it could only find its own voice, it would tell itself, it would sing itself forever. Because what is so wonderful about Pi, even more wonderful than Slovak and Lithuanian and Finnish and English, is that it's an infinite story. There is no last number in Pi. And because there's no last number, there's no second to last number or third to last number. It literally goes on forever. This surpasses human understanding. It stimulates the imagination in a unique way. And to imagine that you could take a sheet of paper as big as this theatre, which is a big theatre. You are very many here this evening, but even if I were to fill all of this room with the wallpaper and fill all of the wallpaper and the floor and the ceiling with numbers of Pi, there would not be enough space. And even if I filled a paper with the numbers the size of Slovakia, or the size of Europe, or the size of the world, or the size of the Milky Way, or the size of the universe, there would not be enough space for all of the numbers. And sometimes I say to myself, that this is what makes pi so special in my mind, and why I come back to it in several of my books, because it's like a universal poem. A poem written not in Slovak or English or Finnish or Lithuanian, but in the language of numbers, my language, but perhaps also yours, as far as it is possible for you to understand it. When I was 25, after I came back from Lithuania, I decided I wanted to speak out loud, like I am today. And the first language I spoke out loud in public was in my language of numbers. I spent one winter learning the number pi, not the 500 numbers I'd learned in the library, but more, because in the time that had passed between then and coming home to England from Lithuania, internet had arrived. Google had arrived. So I Googled the number pi, and I found a page in Japan. It was a supercomputer in Tokyo, and its only job was to calculate the numbers of pi. So it spent all its life calculating the numbers of pi, and it calculated thousands and thousands and thousands of numbers of pi. So I printed out many pages of the calculations, and I had all these numbers, and the story just kept going on and on and on, and I just got so absorbed in the story. I wanted to learn it by heart, as we say in English. Maybe you say something similar in Slovak. When you learn something very, very deeply, we say in English to learn it by heart. And it's very true for me. I didn't learn it with my head, I learned it with my heart. It was very emotional. And I decided I would speak in front of an audience. It was an event that was organized with a charity. I had had epileptic seizures as a small child, and which are very common for people on the spectrum, apparently. And so the charity was an epilepsy charity, and they helped to organize the event. And there was an article in the Times of London, the newspaper, one day before, about this young man who spoke in numbers, and who spoke the number pi. His first language was the number pi. He was going to speak in the number pi, and English people were reading this in front of their eggs and toast, and they were saying, "What is this story about this young man who speaks in numbers? What is this story?" So they said to themselves, "Let's go and listen to the man who talks in pi, who talks in numbers." And so they came on the day to Oxford in March of 2004, and there were not as many as you, I think, but there were some people in the room, and there was even some Americans who were visiting Oxford that day. It was in Oxford. In front of me it was in a museum dedicated to the science, the history of science, and in front of me, on the other side of the room from me, was a blackboard, and on the blackboard was some numbers written with chalk. And someone explained to me that these numbers had been written by Albert Einstein. So it was who was born on March 14th, I believe, and March 14th, 3, like the month, the third month, 314. It's the first numbers of pi. So it was a nice setting, a nice stage to recite this beautiful poem. So I stood up. I was much more like the number 4 than I am today, and so but I stood up, and actually no, I didn't stand up. I sat. That's how shy I was. I was very much more like the number 4. So I sat down. There was no sausage dog to encourage me in the room, unfortunately. Only people, but they had very, open ears and but they were very, I can't really explain what the emotion was like. They were very confused. They didn't know what was going to happen. So I started to speak, and of course they looked at each other and they said, what is he saying? What is he trying to say? What is this? And as I went on and on and on and on and on and on and on, I lost myself in the story, in the landscape, in the boy who is in the hills in the spring with the cheese from Slovakia and it was just beautiful, and I just forgot the people, but it was the best thing I could have done, because I forgot them, and it was like the only thing that was in the room was the number, was pi, and because pi is infinite, it was like there was eternity in the room. And for 5 hours and 9 minutes, because I spoke for 5 hours and 9 minutes, and at the end someone said to me, "You have recited 22,514 decimals of pi. It's a record." So I said, "Oh, okay." But it wasn't for me the important thing. The important thing was to tell the story. And of course it was just the first chapter of an infinite book. But that's as much as I could tell. And so I told this story, and the people were listening for all these hours, and they were completely, and I didn't know this at the time, but they were completely like in a spell. They were listening, and they forgot that they couldn't understand. And they said to themselves, "Okay, actually I can understand what he's saying." And it's almost like they could see what I was seeing. And sometimes also, what is so wonderful about pi is that because it's infinite, there is every combination of numbers possible. So for example, somewhere in the numbers of pi, when you recite 22,000 numbers of pi, there is your telephone number. Somewhere in the story of pi, there is your date of birth, your day and your month and your year. There is your passcode. The passcode you use to access your mail and your text messages and so on. And the people in the room were probably worried that someone would recognize and steal their passcode, pass number. So they were looking at each other, and without realizing it, some of them were also hearing the date of their future death as well, because everything is in pi. Everything is in pi. What they can imagine and what even they can't imagine. And they took this away with them. And there was a journalist, someone was filming, and there was a journalist from a TV journalist, and they interviewed people afterwards. They were asking them, what was it like to listen? And one of the people was crying because they were so moved, but they didn't understand why. But they just said it was almost like a religious experience. So at this point I realized that if I had a gift, it was not simply to count in some ways, but to recount. I don't know if this can translate into Slovak. I'm testing the interpreters here. But in English, we can say to count, and we mean numbers, and we can say recount, and it means to tell a story. And even the verb to tell, originally many English speakers, people who are supposedly native English speakers, they don't know this. But the verb to tell, nowadays we only use it to mean stories. But in the past, in the long ago past, English speakers also used it to mean to count. And when I learned Icelandic for a documentary, I learned conversational Icelandic after 1 week because I had a very good teacher. And she's become a very good friend. She even came to my wedding and sang in Icelandic at my wedding. In Icelandic, you say tala, and it means to count and to speak. So it's the same connection, the same root. So I realized I had this gift not simply to count, but to recount, to tell in both senses of the word, the new sense and the older sense. And I realized that this was my gift, and I would spend my life as best I could for as long as people were ready to listen and to read my words, to write them down. And there would be numbers on every page, of course, but there would be more words, many more words, and the words have changed over the years, and the books have changed, have become more sophisticated, more complex. I have many literary influences and many critics and people who give awards who admire my work more and more. But it has not been easy. And to conclude, I would just say that I'm very happy to see young neurodivergent people speaking so confidently today, as the young lady did at the beginning. Because even when I began writing almost 20 years ago, it would have been impossible to hear this young lady's voice, because the society was not ready to listen. And now it is possible, and books like mine are respected not just as testimony, but as literature in its own right. And I'm very proud to have pioneered this other way of reading and writing and creating literature. So thank you very much for listening to me today. And thank you for your jazz hands.
And I think you are ready to respond some questions, right?
Yes, please. Yeah. If anyone has some questions, I have a headphone if you're more comfortable in Slovak.
Dobre, máme mikrofón.
Someone will come with the microphone.
V slovenčine, v angličtine? Ako? So English question?
Oh, English, okay.
I find your voice and the melody of your speaking really soothing. Is there any audiobook of yours narrated by you, or yeah?
Yeah, there are.
Okay, thank you.
For this book in English, and also for maybe 4 of my books I've been able to narrate them. Yes.
English question?
Yes.
I also have a question. In your book, when you were talking about getting to know literature, you were saying that it's also very difficult for people with your condition and your seeing of the world to understand metaphors and things in between lines and things like that. But what would be interesting for me, after listening to you now, what about the sense of humor? Because I think it's something that is also very special and typical about you, after having read your books and also talking to you. But it must have been difficult as well, because it all goes with hidden meanings and with things that people take for granted, but not people like you. So can you perhaps tell us something more about that?
Yes. So I apparently I have a good sense of apparently I could hear some people laughing, so apparently I was doing something well.
You definitely
but it can't all be accidental. I don't know where this comes from. I think my parents had a good sense of humor, and so it must partly be from just spending so much time as a child, not outdoors with the other children, but indoors reading and hearing my parents making jokes and so on. That probably was part of it. And then also the learning. Before I learned about humor with words, I think it was about humor with pictures. Because often what I'm doing is using pictures, but with words. My language is very visual. And I would watch the films, very old black and white films with people like Charlie Chaplin or the Marx Brothers, and these are very slapstick, very visual gags, jokes, and so you can follow very clearly, visually, the humor. And sometimes there is words as well, so it's almost like the words are like subtitles to the action the physical action, the physical joke, and that way you can acquire both at the same time. And then literature, how I acquired literature, it's true that when I wrote this book here almost 20 years ago, I think at some point even in this book I said that I don't normally read fiction, or I don't use fiction very often, and it's true that for a period of time as an early adult, young adult, I stopped almost completely reading fiction. I never gave up my connection with literature. I still read poetry, for example, but fiction was always more difficult for me for a long time, because it seemed to me that the novels that I read did not seem to speak at all to my own existence as someone who had grown up in a working class family and who saw the world in my own way. And the books were very often written by other social classes and seemed very trivial to me in some respects, and so I was so disappointed, almost like when you fall out of love with someone, you have like an angry falling out, and then you make up later, of course. And so for a time I had like this angry falling out with novels, and then we made up. And today I read novels obviously in different languages, and sometimes it's even easier for me to read novels in translation. So I don't read many English novels, but I will read Polish novels or Czech novels or French novels or German novels, and when I can read them in the original, I read them in the original, and when I can't, I read them in translation. But and I feel closer to the texture of the book in translation. And sometimes it seems to me that international literature is less focused on, it's less trivial in some ways. I'm being very harsh, but it's my feeling sometimes that British literature sometimes is focuses too much on material concerns of the upper classes, and it speaks to very few actual readers, and I love novels that can speak to everyone, and they do exist. Many novels like this exist, and some do in Britain as well, but they're harder to find. So this is my relationship today with fiction.
Okay, thanks. Another question in English?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you spoke about the number pi,
yeah.
You tell us that it speaks to you in a story. What about other irrational numbers like the square root of 2 or the golden ratio?
Yeah, of course there are many infinite numbers. There are probably even, I'm not a mathematician, but I imagine there are even an infinite number of infinite numbers. I wouldn't be surprised. And why did I choose pi and not another infinite number? Well, I didn't. It's pi that chose me. Pi chose me, so I just accepted to be chosen by this number when I was a child. It found me, and it spoke to me in a language I could understand apparently, and I listened and I fell in love with it. And it's like falling in love. People could say, but there are many handsome people in the world. There are many beautiful people in the world. Why do you fall in love with this person? And of course, it's a very good argument. But I'm old-fashioned. I'm a romantic. I like the idea of falling in love and staying in love.
Okay, thanks. Another question?
Hi, I was wondering if you can maybe explain if the words have the same feeling and color and so on for you when they're in different languages, but they describe the same thing. It would be maybe the first part of it. And the second would be, do you have words that have maybe like negative feelings for you, or all of them you see them in a positive and beautiful way?
So what is so interesting about language is that it's always, it's so different. So even though they are trying to say the same thing, they say it differently. And I think what is so interesting about language, this is what people sometimes don't get about language. Language doesn't say anything exactly. it tries to say something. And what makes language interesting is the trying. So when you have an apple, and you try and say this word in Slovak, I can't say it in Slovak, so I'll say it in another language, in Finnish, omena, or in Lithuanian, obwolis, or in Esperanto, pomo. You're not actually saying this thing that you can hold and you can smell and you can eat. You can't. It's not possible. It's a fiction, but it's a fiction we live by. But we are trying to make it with words, with sounds. So when we are talking in whatever language it is, we are trying to remake the thing that we are saying, and of course we can't. We are not God. We can't make as God can make. For people who believe in the original story, the story in the Bible, and it's a very interesting story as well. But for people who for us, we can't make with words. In the Bible, it says that God spoke. He said, "Be," and it was. He said, "Light," and there was light. And when we say apple, there's no apple. And often when we say apple, it's because there isn't an apple. If there was an apple, we wouldn't have to say apple. Speaking is talking about what isn't there very often, and what we want to make appear. And we make it appear as best we can, but it's not the word itself that does all the work. It's part of it, it's a big part of it, but it's not everything. So that's what makes language interesting. Every language tries in a slightly different way to make the object appear, whether in the imagination or in real life. And that's what's so fascinating. And to answer your other question, I wouldn't try and compare languages, because it's uninteresting for me whether pomo or obwolis or omena is more interesting than apple or beautiful, or I can't tell. It's not interesting for me as a question, but because it's meaningful for the people who use these words, because they're not using them on their own. They're using them in context, in story, in community, together. They're making a world possible. And the only thing that I find ugly is when people try to take words away, when people try to take away from people their voice. And this is what is happening in the world today, that there is one man in Moscow who is trying to take a whole language, a whole way of seeing the world away, because he doesn't want people to see the world in this way. He wants the world to see in his way, and the world is much more intelligent than he is and doesn't agree with him, and he will fail in the end. That is my opinion. That is the way of history. But he's trying and he's failing, but this is why people are so against what is happening, because we are witnessing an attempt to take away a part of the world, a part of seeing the world and saying the world. And this is what makes us human. And if we were to lose this, we would lose a part of ourselves. And this is what I find so ugly.
Any more questions? Ďalšie otázky? Nech sa páči, slovenský, anglický.
Good evening. So I would like to ask you how many languages can you actually speak, because you mentioned it a couple of times, and which one is, or which three would you pick as your most favorite ones, or which one is the best one for you?
If you can imagine, so my mother, for example, she has 9 children, but I would never ask her, which is your favorite child? And I think in the same way, I could never answer the question about languages, because the languages are all listening, and they're very jealous. So, but more seriously, no, the language I use today mostly is French, in fact, because I've lived in France for 15 years, and I write in both French and English, and sometimes I have to translate, when I'm speaking in English, I have to translate from French into English, because I use French all the time. Of course I continue to use English, because even though it was never easy for me, I think what is so interesting about my writing is the fact that it's not an easy language for me, and that makes my writing interesting, and I hope at its best beautiful, because what makes things beautiful in my mind is not just perfection, whatever that might be. I don't actually even know that it exists, but the trying something and trying again and trying again and trying again. It's a quality that sometimes we don't appreciate enough, but it's something that I think can make something very beautiful, including language. And I would also say that what other language? I don't know. I wouldn't say how many languages I know, because it's, again, I don't like putting numbers on things so much. My editor puts numbers on my numbers of languages I speak and so on, but I won't speak about that because it's hard to say and hard to quantify. It depends on how you quantify language and fluency and so on, and many of the languages I can understand more or less, or read or write or speak, so it depends. But I know that in Slovakia there are some people who know Esperanto, which is a wonderful international language that it comes from this part of the world. Originally it was an invented language, and I learned some of this when I was a child from books, and like the number pi, and it's one of those things that people sometimes consider slightly eccentric. And but for me, I'm not an Esperantist as such, in the sense of I don't know that we need a universal language necessarily, but I like the idea of mixing languages, and I understand that people say about Slovak that it's the Esperanto of the languages in your part of the world, and that makes me imagine that yours is a particularly beautiful language, because you're able to take all these different influences and make it into something very, very beautiful. So it makes me want to learn Slovak one day.
Okay, can we have more questions? Daniel, is it okay to?
Yes. If there are any more questions,
if
please.
If there are any more, I think there are. Nech sa páči.
I would just I'd just like to share the feeling from your presentation, and it's very deep, and I'm really grateful for your sharing, and I'm imagining how all the colors and numbers and everything are you able to share and to translate it to for us to experience. And I also would like to thank you for this symbol of infinity, and this gives me really a lot of courage and meaning to also what we are trying to do here in Slovakia, to bring a new way how to understand people who may look different from the very beginning as children, and maybe they are doing a really wonderful job for understanding the universe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next question, or you want to comment, or can we go?
If there's any
I
more.
think we have here two questions. So.
Hi, this is Philip. I would like to ask you, maybe you could share with us what is your next project that you're working on, like the book project?
Yeah. So at the moment I'm working on my 10th book. So it's been a long journey and many books in between. And this one is perhaps the most ambitious. It's about neurodiversity in a way, but it's not so much about the theme itself. There are books that probably could do that better than I could, explain why it's important and what it means, and how we can move towards a more neurodiverse friendly society. My project is more about reaching out to people who are neurodiverse, men and women of different countries, different cultures, different languages, different ages, to tell their stories. And so they speak with me and I speak with them, and I take many notes. It's a very long project. It's probably taken over a year of research. And there are 9 people altogether. Some of them are famous. One of them is world famous, in fact, an actor in Hollywood. And but all of them have remarkable stories, careers, or simply life stories, inner lives that are beautiful and meaningful and that deserve their place in literature, because for so long, and probably for far too long, literature, and this goes to the question about fiction and why for a time I was frustrated with novels. For too long it seemed to me that we can't find these voices in literature. We find doctors who write about neurodiverse people, often quite clumsily and quite awkwardly, because they are only seeing part of the story, of course, from the outside. They have no way of seeing from the inside, and I wanted to bring to literature, as I've done with my own story and other stories as well already, but I wanted to really bring contemporary lives, neurodiverse lives into literature. And so these people's stories will be the next, the collection of these stories will be my next project, and I hope it will come out in maybe 1 year's time.
Okay, I think it was the last question.
Okay.
So let me thank you a lot for your lecture, and let me thank a lot to Absinthe Publishing House. They don't like to be visible, but they are these invisible guys who are bringing us great books, followed by great authors. So thanks for all your production and making such wonderful events. And Daniel is staying for a while here on the stage, ready to sign the books. We will bring a table in a while, and if you have book already, he can sign it for you, or you can still buy this book in front of the hall. And I don't know, maybe he will stay a little bit in after the event in the bar. Maybe you can ask him something also individually. So thanks a lot. One more special applause, and thanks a lot. Now we can see you, and we know that everyone is or was enjoying it. Thanks a lot.